Let's be clear. If you send NATO troops to Ukraine in a combat role, that means war between NATO and Russia. And the only way you can do that is if you're ready for war with Russia. And there is no way that NATO is ready for war with Russia right now.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen. And today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by General Sir Richard Shirreff, NATO's former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and the author of 2017 War with Russia, an urgent warning from senior military command. General Shirreff, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, I wonder if you can just give us your assessment of the current state of the war.
Well, I think the optimism of the early spring of 2023 has given way to quite a lot of pessimism, frankly. The Russians have got the upper hand, or are getting the upper hand. They've got the strategic initiative in the east. The Russians are able to build up capability, lost capability, quicker than the Ukrainians. They're replacing their ammunition. They've had over 1 million artillery rounds, 155 or heavy artillery rounds from the North Koreans in the last since August last year, the last 9 months or so. And Ukraine is suffering. Ukraine is finding it very difficult to hold against the Russians. We saw the failure of the much vaunted Ukrainian counteroffensive last summer and late spring, which in my view was there was a huge degree of over-optimism, largely put about by Western media. And the reality being, of course, that without air power, without the capability that the West needs to provide to Ukraine, it was never going to succeed. But the Russians are moving forward. Set against that, there have been some remarkable Ukrainian successes. I would highlight, for example, Ukrainian neutralizing the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. And to do that without a navy has been really clever by the Ukrainians. They've used drones and long-range precision missiles. So there have been real successes there. And of course, Ukrainian hits against Russian energy infrastructure as well. But I think we have to be pretty gloomy about the prospects for Ukraine this year. And it all comes down to the West not providing the capabilities that Ukraine needs: ammunition, equipment, long-range precision missiles. Of course, the $60 million package in Washington has been stalled by the impact of Trump on the American run-up to the American election. And unless Ukraine gets the kit, the ammunition, and the long-range missiles that it needs, it is going to continue to go backwards. And that is really bad news.
Well, let's come on to that, because in the last 24 hours, we've had the UK Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron visiting Donald Trump in Florida. And of course, it is Trump who is seen as being the big kind of blockage in approving this renewed US military aid to Ukraine, because it would appear that his supporters in Congress are taking their lead from him. Do you think Donald Trump is persuadable on the issue of Ukraine?
I don't know that he is. I just simply couldn't comment on Trump. I mean, he's such a I think words fail me when I try and, there is precious little logic. There is a real irrationality there. And I think we have to be very, very concerned. But the impact of Trump on the election, yes, of course, negative. If Trump gets in, the potential impacts on NATO will be more than negative. But the very threat of a Trump election is forcing NATO now to think very hard about Trump-proofing itself. And so the work put together at the last week's Foreign Ministers Summit in NATO, for example, the putting together of €100 billion package of measures to Ukraine without Trump, without America, is really good news. And the impact of Trump is forcing European members of NATO, and I'd also include Canada in that, Canada shouldn't be exempt, to think really hard about how they can Trump-proof their support for Ukraine. But there's another point here. It's a strategic point. NATO has provided, and America has provided the equipment to, the decision has been to provide the equipment needed to avoid Ukrainian defeat. As we've seen, that's still not good enough, and it's running out of sand. And it's been done with current capability. There has been no mobilization of the military-industrial base, no long-term ammunition contracts, multi-year ammunition contracts agreed with industry. And the consequence of that is that it's not enough. The only thing that is going to work, frankly, is if NATO switches its strategy, not to avoid defeat, but to achieve victory over Russia. Because only victory over Russia is going to provide Ukraine and Europe with the security it needs. And allied to that, NATO will have at the same time to put together a very, very powerful and strong deterrent capability around Ukraine, to include Ukraine in NATO. And that is something that is going to be with us for generations to come, or at least a generation.
But General, why do you think that hasn't happened so far? I'm sure there'll be many people watching or listening, our regular Frontline viewers, who will think, well, the West should have been aiming to help Ukraine defeat Russia from the get-go.
It comes down to political vision, it comes down to political leadership, and it comes down to the moral courage of our political leaders. And all three are in deficit. That is the answer to your question.
And when we talk about Trump-proofing NATO, specifically, what does that look like? I mean, in terms of the minimum defence spend, there's been a lot of discussion. In fact, Donald Trump himself, when he was president, flagged the fact that, in his view, too many NATO countries, and it probably was a fair point, weren't actually spending enough on defence spending. There's the 2% of GDP minimum. Should that rise to a baseline of 2.5% to 3%? What does Trump-proofing look like in practice?
Well, I mean, you're right. Trump was right all along, as have been many American presidents and secretaries of state who've highlighted the imbalance between the American contribution to NATO and the Europe and Canadian contribution to NATO. So what does Trump-proofing NATO look like? Well, number one, it means Trump-proofing the measures to support Ukraine and to give Ukraine the means to achieve victory. And that's going to have to come from European and members of NATO and Canada. Number two, it means spending the money needed to give our military capability the edge that it needs. Now, clearly, and it's an arbitrary figure, 2%. It was interesting listening to James Heapy on the news this morning talking about 2.5% now and a pledge of 3% in the manifestos of both major parties for the election. My own view, 3% is probably the minimum. But the key thing is output. It's not input. It's what do you get for your buck? And that requires a long, hard look at defense. In the UK, it particularly means a long, hard look at how to rebuild the army so that it is a first-class, top-rated army with the manpower, the equipment, the sustainability, the logistics, the training that is needed to provide a real lead in NATO. And it's about delivering output, not just thinking in sort of broad brush terms about percentages of GDP.
Do we need to be more creative as well? I was speaking only last week on Frontline to the economist Timothy Ash, who's been very strong on the fact that he believes now is the time, in fact, he thinks we should have done this months ago, to use frozen Russian assets to fund military aid for Ukraine. Should we be looking again at that?
Absolutely. And I think Timothy Ash is absolutely on the money there. And it's one of very many measures that need to be looked at. And it comes down to boldness, taking risk, and sticking heads above parapet. And this comes back to my points about political leadership and moral courage, which frankly have been lacking. I would also go further and say, purely in the military sense, we've got to be creative. We should rule nothing out to do what needs to be done, including, if necessary, looking at a sort of Scandinavian-style limited conscription to overcome the problems of army manpower. All these issues have got to be looked at, and nothing should be off the table.
What about what President Macron intimated a few weeks ago about actually sending troops from NATO countries, if not to the front line, and certainly to Ukraine? Do you think that is feasible at all?
I think it's absolutely feasible. And I think President Macron is absolutely right to be raising these issues. I would say two things. One is President Macron's message would carry much greater weight if France was doing more in terms of supporting Ukraine. If you look at what Germany is providing, France is way, way behind the curve in terms of the actual material and ammunition support. I think the second point I'd make is that the sending of NATO military troops to Ukraine is in a sense the last resort. The way to avoid the last resort is to provide Ukraine with the ammunition, the long-range missiles, and the other capabilities it needs, so that you don't have to send NATO troops to Ukraine. Because let's be clear, if you send NATO troops to Ukraine in a combat role, that means war between NATO and Russia. And the only way you can do that is if you're ready for war with Russia. And there is no way that NATO is ready for war with Russia right now.
I mean, that is very interesting that you say that NATO is not ready for war with Russia, because there might be some who would argue that actually the nature of Vladimir Putin is that you do have to take him head on, that appeasement of him will not work, and that the West should have been more prepared at this point for potentially, if needs be, taking Putin on head on.
And I'm one of those. The only way to deal with Russia is to show strength. Any sign of weakness, and Russia will probe and continue to probe and take advantage of you. That has always been the Russian way, and it continues to be the Russian way. So the only solution, therefore, is to show strength, is to build up strength, is to build up our armed forces, to provide a really cast iron deterrent capability. There can be no appeasement. Appeasement of Putin only leads to further grabs on his part. And the only way to offset that is through demonstrating real strength.
And just to go back to this point about the US and the military aid that is currently being held up in Congress, do you think in a way that it is too easy for European NATO leaders to focus on the issues in America? Whereas, as you say, General, there is issue with the amount of military aid that has been supplied by France. There's discussion as to whether the Germans should provide Taurus missiles, for example. Should we be asking ourselves deeper questions as well in Europe?
Absolutely, we should be. We should absolutely be asking deeper questions. I mean, I hear continuously, if I listen to the Daily Telegraph, Ukraine, the latest podcast put out daily. I'm not a Daily Telegraph reader, but I have to say it provides a very good update on what's going on. You will hear our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, talking about give Ukraine the means to do the job and they'll achieve it. Slava Ukraini. Well, it's all talk. Britain did a really good job at the start. But Britain has run out of ammunition, run out of guns, run out of tanks we can send, and is unable to provide the equipment. And if 2 years ago, the British government, the MOD, had let a series of multi-year ammunition contracts stretching out 5, if not 10 years, had invested in more equipment, had invested in ammunition, had invested in defense, it would be able to do more. So it's the sort of, it comes back to this talk, sounds great, but actually, where's the beef?
And I suppose that the problem that politicians always have is the politics of it all and the economics of it all and the sheer cost of providing Ukraine with the military support it needs. I mean, discussing by how much defence spending should increase, should the UK make a commitment for 2.5%, should it rise to 3%? And should both major parties in the UK put that in their manifesto for the upcoming general election? The difficulty is, in the UK and around the world, there are enormous spending pressures on all areas of government. And politically, a cynic might say there are no votes in defence. Do you think there is the political will to actually communicate to the public the need to have defence spending increases on the level required?
Of course there are spending pressures, but I'd put it this way. This war in Ukraine is not just a war against Ukraine. It's a war against Ukraine. It's a war against the West, and it's a war against Ukraine joining the West. This is a war. If you ask any Russian, he'll think this is a war against NATO. And if we don't provide Ukraine with the means to achieve victory, be under no illusions. Putin will continue the movement. We have in Europe, on our eastern border, an angry, revanchist Russia determined to rebuild a Russian empire, determined to swallow up Ukraine. And once it's swallowed up Ukraine, it will move on. It'll move on to Moldova. It'll move on to finish off the invasion, finish off the work it started in Georgia in 2008. And it is quite likely to move on to one of the Baltic states, if not all of them, all of whom were part of the Soviet Empire and indeed part of the Tsarist Empire. So they think of the Baltic states, Russians think of it as theirs. If that happens, that is war with NATO. That is Britain engaged in an existential fight with Russia. How much more effective, how much more cost effective to increase defense spending now? Yes, of course, it'll impact on infrastructure and transport and education and the NHS. But I can tell you, unless we do this, we face the prospect of a total catastrophe. And that is why we have to dig deep now. And that is why our political leaders need to explain to the British people, the British electorate, what the stakes are, because they're very, very high.
General, just go back to the situation on the front line in Ukraine at the moment. It was interesting that General Budanov, Ukraine's General Budanov, did an interview with German television, I think, recently, in which he said that he anticipates a fresh Russian offensive in the late spring, early summer. As things stand, given what we've been discussing about the need for more supplies for Ukraine, how do you think they will cope with that? How do you think Ukraine will stand up to that offensive?
Well, with difficulty, unless they're given more, exactly as what we've been talking earlier, exactly as I said at the start of the discussion. Unless Ukraine is given the capability to withstand that, the ammunition, the long-range precision missiles, and the military equipment that they need, they will find it very, very difficult. And if that happens, if there is a Russian counter-offensive in the spring, late summer, unless Ukraine is given the capabilities, I would anticipate potentially significant amounts of Ukrainian land being captured again by Russia.
That's very interesting, because actually what we've seen in recent months, yes, Russia have made some small incremental advances, for example, capturing Avdiivka, but actually we haven't seen any significant breakthroughs. But you think that could change in the coming months if we're not careful?
I wouldn't rule anything out. I think the Ukrainians will hold extremely effectively. What I'm saying is I think potentially there could be more land recaptured by Russia. Whether there's a major breakthrough or not depends entirely, again, comes back to my point earlier about giving Ukraine the means to defend itself. But more than that, the means to ultimately defeat Russia, and we're a long way short of that.
I mentioned General Budanov a moment ago. Of course, we have seen some changes in the Ukrainian military leadership in recent months. General Zaluzhny has been replaced by General Syrskyi. Have you noted any change in Ukraine's operational strategy since that transition?
I think it's difficult from this distance to comment on that. But what I would say is it's entirely understandable to replace a senior general who has carried the burden of the defense of Ukraine and achieved extraordinary successes in the early months of the war. 2 years on, I mean, people get tired, and maybe fresh thinking is needed. But what you've got to be so careful about is widespread movement and removal of personnel, which disturbs the balance, disturbs the teamwork, disturbs the dynamic of headquarters, and can cause a degree of confusion, rather than where you need to manage it, any manpower changes carefully.
And whilst Ukraine is in this difficult position of waiting for fresh Western military aid, what realistically is their best strategy? I mean, they have had success, as you mentioned, General. You know, it's been phenomenally successful in terms of eliminating much of the Black Sea Fleet around Sevastopol. Also, we've seen some of their attacks on Russian energy infrastructure. Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian oil refineries are reportedly now forcing Russia to import gas from Kazakhstan. So they have had some really significant success. What do you think is their best strategy for the coming months, given we have this impasse with Western military aid?
I think I know, again, I wouldn't second guess the Ukrainian command, but if I was in that position, I would be looking to hold on, to dig deep, literally dig deep, build defensive capabilities, build defensive fortifications, strengthen my defense in order to allow me to build up capability, to train with new equipment, new capability, to bring new equipment into service, and to build up with a view to launching offensives further downstream. But the absolute priority is to hold.
And General Shirreff, just to go back to Donald Trump and what effect he may have on NATO, and I appreciate, a bit like it's almost impossible to read the mind of Vladimir Putin, it's almost impossible to read the mind of Donald Trump, but do you think he would withdraw America from NATO? It's something that has been speculated on. He did an interview recently in which he appeared to deny that. But do you think we should be making preparations for potentially the US withdrawing from NATO were Trump to be re-elected?
I think you have to assume the worst case and be pleased if the worst case doesn't come about. I mean, the reality of an American withdrawal from NATO, yes, the alliance may be able to future-proof itself in the ways we've discussed earlier. But the bottom line is this, that the alliance would find it, the European members of NATO and Canada would find it really, really difficult, if not impossible, to fully replace all the capabilities that America brings to the NATO party. So what? So start preparing, start thinking about it, start putting together. It comes back to defense spending and building multi-year contracts and building up your military industrial complex and capabilities. Would it go all the way? Well, it might. But even if Trump does, I think there's a high chance that even if he doesn't pull America out of the alliance, America would become a sort of sleeping partner in the alliance, still in the alliance, but not exerting providing the full suite of American capability. Still able to influence things there, and that's obviously something we would hope for.
So even if he doesn't withdraw America from NATO completely, he may well, first of all, just cease US military aid to Ukraine, but potentially even push for immediate peace talks with Russia and with Ukraine,
he said he'd end the war in 24 hours. He said he would encourage Russia to attack any NATO member that doesn't meet the spending requirements. I mean, wild, deeply irresponsible talk. And let's be clear, ending the war in 24 hours would mean nothing more than another Munich 1938. Putin would rebuild, regain, retrain, regenerate, and have another go at finishing the work he started in 2014.
I just wonder on the issue of Trump. I mean, we started this conversation by talking about David Cameron, former UK Prime Minister, now Foreign Secretary, his visit to see him in Florida in the last 24 hours. It's interesting that another former UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who has been a great friend of Ukraine, and under him, of course, there was a huge amount of UK military aid provided to Ukraine. He has appeared to endorse Trump for re-election this November, which to me seems to be completely at odds with his pledged support for Ukraine. Can you make any sense of that?
No, not at all.
It is a very curious situation. Just finally, General, and we really appreciate your time on Frontline. I wonder where you see Russia's alliances. A lot has been made of them receiving Iranian-made Shahed drones. It's interesting also that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has been meeting with Chinese officials amid warnings that China is increasingly helping Russia's defense industrial base. Where do you see Russia and its alliances at the moment?
Well, I think Russia, it's getting material support from North Korea. It's getting support from Iran. And you mentioned the allegations of indirect support from China, which I'm sure is absolutely the case. I think the wider issue with Russia is the reality that much of the global South is sympathetic to Russia. I mean, sub-Saharan African countries, for example, will remember the part, particularly if you go to countries like Zimbabwe, they'll remember the part that the Soviet Union played in their anti-colonial struggles. So there will be a natural sympathy for Russia. Russia's pretty closely aligned to South Africa and other countries like that. So, and the West has really got to focus on winning the strategic or the battle of the strategic narrative and persuade. And, another country, India. India has at the start of the war, on the invasion in February 2022, was getting 10% of its oil from Russia. Since then, it's now something like 40% of its oil imports come from Russia. So in a very real sense, India is bankrolling Russian defense offensive military capability. And there are too many countries around the world sitting on the fence and watching the genocidal activities of Russia without calling Russia out.
And is there more we can do to turn the screw on nations like India, who we have, relatively good, strong relations with? Is there any more we can do to help disincentivize them from doing that?
Well, I think you'd better ask a diplomat rather than a soldier on that question. But my point is the battle of the strategic narrative has yet to be really won by the West, by the UK, and I think a huge amount of UK influence could go towards winning that narrative, in concert, of course, with our other allies and friends.
General Sir Richard Shirreff, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.